People of Middle-earth, is Rings of Power an adaptation? Or a new story entirely? Or something worse? That is what my wife and I have been wondering as we've been watching Rings of Power. So far, only the first 4 episodes of the first season have dropped, so we've been cringing. A lot. Still, as a screenwriter and director, the choices the showrunners made makes me wonder about the nature of adaptations and especially their IP, or their intellectual property, and how that works in the world of Hollywood. So let's talk about what Rings of Power is actually based on and how the producer's choice of source material affected the show that they have created and we are now seeing the fruits of. I am Carl T. Rogers, the Story Philosopher, and I'm a writer and director helping you to launch your screenwriting career. I'm not going to be talking very much today about whether the show is good or bad, especially since like I said, the whole first season ain't really out yet. But I think it's safe to say that the showrunners' hands were tied even before they wrote a single page of the show. Now, in addition to writing The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, most of you probably are aware by now that J.R.R. Tolkien also wrote a history of Middle-earth called the Silmarillion. Now, those books are kind of old, right? Like, he died a long time ago. Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion are probably old. Is there any chance that they fall under public domain? And Amazon could just kind of do whatever they want with it since it's public domain, just like we always have another remake of King Arthur or Sherlock Holmes or anything like that because those are in the public domain. Could the same thing happen with Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion? Well, the answer is no. That has to do with the rules of public domain in the United States especially. If a book was written in 1926 or earlier, then it is considered to be in the public domain according to U.S. copyright law. And this kind of, as every new calendar year starts, this then updates again because of the way the laws work. But if something was old but not quite that old, like if it was published in 1964 or earlier, it could be in the public domain if the copyrights have not been renewed. But the Tolkien estate, of course, renews all of their copyrights, and that's why none of Tolkien's works are in the public domain. So if you are a screenwriter looking to adapt a famous book, then you have to make sure that it is in the public domain first. And I speak from experience because I did just that with an Edgar Allan Poe poem. I turned that into a short film years ago, and I wrote it and directed it, and then it screened across the world. And you can not only watch the film, but especially watch what I learned as a filmmaker and storyteller from that process by watching this video right up here. Now, since Rings of Power takes place in the Second Age of Middle-earth, that's thousands of years before the events of Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, then that means that Rings of Power is probably based on the Silmarillion, right? Wrong. In an interview with Variety, the filmmakers discussed that they have the rights to The Hobbit, to all 3 Lord of the Rings novels, and that's all. Okay. But they didn't make a show based on The Hobbit or based on Lord of the Rings. I mean, we just had, a Hobbit trilogy, and nobody's ever going to top Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy that broke records with how many Oscars it won, in addition to being just amazing. Instead, they decided to make a show based on the Silmarillion. So how did they write a show about the events of the Silmarillion without having the rights to the Silmarillion, without having the IP? Well, they didn't. They tried to, though. They use, as the primary basis for the Rings of Power, the appendices of Lord of the Rings. So it's basically a very shortened overview, a summary of some of the events from the Silmarillion that's in the back of The Return of the King. And then they made the rest up. Now, I'm not saying that everything made up is going to be bad. I mean, sometimes you can take a source material and add things to it and come out with a very amazing experience, like with Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. He had to change things and add some things and take some things out. That's normal when you do an adaptation from one medium of storytelling to another. But the thing with Rings of Power is that it makes it to where it's in this weird gray area where it's not really an adaptation, but it's not really its own completely new thing either because it still exists in the world of Middle-earth. Here's how that works for what Amazon had to do, for what the writing team had to deal with. If there was an event in Middle-earth that the Silmarillion mentions, but is not mentioned in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, or any of the other books that they have the rights to, then Amazon was not even allowed to mention it in Rings of Power. And that's why Owen Williams, writing for Empire, calls Rings of Power extrapolated rather than adapted from Tolkien's work. Peter Jackson and his writing team had to deal with the same type of limitation, but it wasn't really much of an issue since they had the rights to what they were adapting. Amazon, not so much. Amazon wanted to make a big budget adaptation of the Silmarillion, and that's what it seems like at least, but they can't because they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion. Tolkien estate still has the rights to the Silmarillion and a lot of Tolkien's other works besides The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So essentially, Amazon paid $250 million just for the IP and then used very small parts of that IP to build off of to make their own show called Rings of Power. So in that way, to me, even as someone who has not read the Silmarillion yet, I've read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but not the Sil, Rings of Power is a lot more like Lord of the Rings fan fiction than an adaptation, even though, legally speaking, it's an adaptation. The weird world of intellectual property. So why did Amazon do this? Well, because they knew the power of brand recognition. Lord of the Rings is a universally known and beloved IP, and Amazon is banking on people watching it. Even if they hate the show, people want to watch it just to see what all the controversy is about. They want to see if it's any good. They want to see what everybody's talking about. And my wife and I were the same way. We expected it to be bad, but we're still watching it. And that's what Amazon knew would happen even in the worst case scenario. So we'll save my thoughts on the storytelling strengths and weaknesses of Rings of Power for another video. But let me know in the comments if you think that Rings of Power is an adaptation, a piece of fan fiction, or something else entirely. And finally, for all the aspiring screenwriters out there, I hope that this has helped illustrate why being a working screenwriter is not just about being an excellent storyteller, but also having a lot of business acumen. And if you want to learn more about the business side of Hollywood, then click up here to watch my masterclass to learn the 3 keys that you need to launch your screenwriting career without moving to LA first. Right up here.